Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I have indeed the pleasure to moderate this panel on a very timely and exciting topic around MT. The reason why the title is including data-driven, it is because in many cases, data is a good way, or is sometimes the best way, to explain, justify, and improve things. And data is used in many ways. We all know that probably on this call, but I think it's interesting also to hear different perspectives from different people. And we have a panel with different people today, definitely different backgrounds, different organizations. So that should be a very interactive and very exciting discussion. And as usual, in this value cast, we're going to focus on value. So value is important because we can talk for hours about technicalities and other aspects of machine translation, but also other technologies. But essentially, at the end of the day, what really matters is the value that this technology brings, the value that this technology can add to a business, whatever the business is, whatever the size of the business is, whatever the industry is. So I would like to start this session by asking every panelist to share, first of all, to introduce himself or herself, but also to share his or her perspective on this topic, which is quite broad. So I would like to start and invite Janice Campbell from Adobe to open the session. And Janice, the floor and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for, sorry. See, there we go. Not used to WebEx and just making sure you can see everything. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here, and thank you very much. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what Adobe is doing in machine translation. So first of all, what's Adobe? I'm sure that you're familiar with the company. But this month, actually, we're 39 years in business, so that's in December. So that's a great thing, and we create the tools that people use for, like, in the digital media and the digital marketing space, and that's all I'm going to tell you about it. It's a pretty well-known company. So what are we doing as far as machine translation? There's something that I guess we might want to get rid of this screen here. We call it a Zen. So we've used this for a couple of years now because our focus is on making sure that customers all around the world that use our products have the same Adobe experience. So what we mean by that, I guess we're implying that often the English-speaking customer gets the best use cases, the best experience. So we want to make sure that with our globalization team, but where in that ecosystem does machine translation fit? So how can machine translation be used to help deliver content to people around the world so they have that same experience? So we started to use machine translation around 2009. And that was in doing a pilot test, customizing 2 languages on Adobe authored content, and to see what the quality, performance, speed, and cost might be. So that turned out to be a very positive experience, and that was sort of back in the days of SMT and hybrid. Then the few years after that, starting about 2010, the team looked at evaluating a number of different machine translation provider offerings and selected a few to test and to compare and use some quality evaluations for that. In around 2013, then we had the first early adopters, which was probably primarily the help and support content, which is the largest volume of content that we do produce at the company, but also the forums were some early adopters as well. And then we made the transition from SMT to NMT around 2017. So, okay, there we go. Sometimes getting used to the WebEx, sorry. We actually have a RESTful web service that we use. We call it Amethyst, Adobe Machine Translation Service. And what it is just an API that allows anybody at Adobe to connect to our various subscriptions that we have for machine translation. And it is hosted on a very secure platform, and we do have regular audits about that. We use New Relic to monitor the alerts and resolve problems as fast as possible. And then we also are part of the critical service monitoring process at Adobe. So one thing that we've done fairly recently is to try to figure out what is the fallback. What happens when Amethyst goes out? What happens if one of our service providers goes out? What happens when a particular language goes out? So we have a couple of different scenarios, and we've put together a plan that we're now having reviewed by some of the major stakeholders, since it's not just the globalization group at Adobe, but also various other stakeholders who connect to our service. And I guess you have to click in there. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of an overview of our use cases. This is not all encompassing, but it'll give you an idea of where we're using machine translation. Well, the major place is, of course, on the product content, which is all of the Adobe authored help and marketing and some UI. Primarily help, but we also do some of the other types of content as well. And we support 14 trained engines, custom engines, I should say 14 languages that we support, but with generic engines, we support like 90, something like that. So this is primarily Adobe authored content. And in some cases, we actually release MT only. Maybe later, some of it gets written over by post-edited. In other cases, we only do post-editing. So it depends on the product, the business unit, and the language. So when we do MT only, we've had scenarios of opt-in. So there's a widget on a page, use at your own risk. The reason we do that is we want to keep people in our ecosystem. We don't want them going out to some other type of online service. They should be navigating in our system. So we offer that to them, and of course the engines are trained, but we also have now recently gone with an opt-out. So there's one particular business unit that is delivering help in, I think 11 languages. That's machine translation first. Some of that is then written over later by post-editing. One of the biggest users of the stock engines is the community forums. We used to have a number of language forums, but we found out that most people just go to the English forum because that's where most of the answers are. So we allow people to translate using a drop-down menu. It supports right now 13 languages, but since the engine behind that is actually up to 90 languages, if somebody writes in a language that's not on the menu, they can translate into one of the major languages on the menu, but they can't actually choose that one. That will probably expand over time, so we'll see. This is on demand, it's not cached, so of course it's a lot of usage. And then there are many teams at Adobe that do customer feedback, verbatims through either surveys or Net Promoter Score type of thing. Again, user generated, any language pair up to 90, and stock engine. One of the interesting things that we do also is we actually provide machine translation to customers inside of a product. And two of those cases are Adobe Experience Manager, which is our CMS, and then XD, which is a sort of website design tool. And it allows people to create content, build content, and test it using different languages to see how it might lay out, if there's any truncations or any other display issues. So that's helpful for customers. Also, Adobe Spark, you're probably familiar with that. It's a free tool up till now, and it's a consumer type of tool that allows you to tell stories. And there are many templates, icons, graphics that are used that you can avail of in creating your story. So they have some human translation of some of those search keywords, but they also use machine translation to supplement those keywords, and that they use also for indexing. So there's some experiments and tests and proof of concept and things that we do over time. We act as a consultant for many other teams at Adobe who might just do things on their own, but they also want to have some expert advice. So our team can provide insight or help them do evaluations of different types of engines. And here's some of the use cases. Sensei, which is Adobe AI, has used a stock engine to actually generate quite large volumes of cross-lingual embeddings. And that was something that happened fairly recently, and they will probably continue doing, but they had such a large volume. And then we have also live chat. We've been approached by several of the support teams that is not for creating a multilingual chatbot, but actually for live chat, the sort of bi-directional conversation, scripted as well as user-generated content. And we've helped them evaluate a number of different types of engines, whether they're stock or customized, and help them to make a decision about what they want to do. User voice, another similar type of feedback tool that we've also helped them in their decision-making process. So, sorry, I'm going backwards, sorry. Metrics and measures. So what do we measure and why do we do it? We actually do it. What we do is we want to make sure that our system, the platform that we use, the hub that we have, the API, that whole platform, which connects people inside of Adobe to the different subscriptions that we have, we want to make sure that's a very reliable, robust system, that it's secure. That's probably the utmost importance. We spent a couple of years working on that. Also quality of the output, which we measure that quality in a number of different ways. I won't be telling you all of those ways, but showing you some examples. Customer engagement or customer satisfaction, probably one of the hardest things to do, and we've attempted to do that a number of times. Of course, everybody wants to measure costs and ROI, and we did a number of exercises that what were the savings, what was the cost of the systems that we license, etc. It didn't turn out to really be that useful. So actually, it's the globalization team as a whole that uses that as one of within their whole entire metrics of like cost per word and usage and things like that. So we don't measure that anymore. We focus more on whether or not customers are able to do what they need to do. And we want to be able to use these metrics and these measures to maybe take corrective action. We want to make better decisions about what we should do next or how to improve things. And so I'm going to show you some examples. Like this is a couple of dashboards that we have. We have 3 major dashboards. It's really hard to see, and that's on purpose. So we measure the performance of the services, whether it's the Amethyst API service or whether it's the connections that we make. And we get alerts when something is wrong, when it's sometimes it's just a warning that there's a spike, but we want to investigate all those things. And we do pretty much have 24/7 monitoring of our system 6 days a week, I think it is. So we also track usage. And this is just a snapshot. We can do it by different types of engines. We can do it by different types of business units. But everybody has a client ID that joins our service, and we can track their usage. And many of them want to know how much they're using and in which languages. So we measure that. Also, evaluation. We have a number of different ways. Right now, we're doing only blue, tur, and edit distance, but we also outsource some other types of evaluations, human, as well as some other types of auto scores that we do on a occasional basis. Okay, and this one's a kind of an interesting, this was done by Adobe.com web production team, and there's a consumer product that the marketing content was not localized into a number of languages, so they wanted to do some experiment for about 18 months, kind of on and off, because sometimes when they updated the site, the widget broke, so that had to be redone. But over time, we measured how many visits, and of those visits, how many people clicked on the widget to translate, machine translate, knowing full well that it was machine translation, how many went back to English. And we didn't ask, was this translation helpful? We said, was this helpful? and just assumed that they meant, because we want to measure whether or not the translation helped them to do what they wanted to do or find the information or download information or fill out a form, those kind of things. And so we felt it was very successful. Do customers feel satisfied? Well, we don't really know. We don't ask them, were you able to read this accurately? But they were able to actually perform a function, and they stayed within the machine translation. And finally, we also had an app that you could download, and we tried to test an English page versus an empty page at 2 different periods of time. So it's not a real A/B test. But we used other analytics that the SEO department helped us with as well. And so we checked bounce rate, exit rate, these kind of typical analytics, as well as how many people downloaded. We did not find a lot of differences in most of the major analytics, but it is hard to say, is it really useful or not? Probably we would localize the content and then, see how that measures up. But it gave us a good indication that people were slightly more apt to download on a machine translated page, but it could be just purely coincidental as well. It's really hard to know that. Then what's in store for us for the future? We're working on adding MTQE, the quality estimation metric, which we think will be much more useful maybe than some of the other ones that we measure. Looking at new providers, new types of engines, different ways to customize. Should we do terminology only? Should we do more granular, like not just digital media as a whole, but marketing in digital media, for example? And we're experimenting with a number of those things. And of course, what kind of data will we continue to need to make decisions about changing tools, upgrading tools, retraining the engines and that sort of thing. There's a lot of data that we're trying to pull from our TMS, which has been a bit of a challenge. So anyway, when it's time for questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Great presentation, great perspective. And I would say you just use words that I really wanted to hear today, like customer satisfaction, customer experience, because that's also value. I know sometimes when you talk about value, we talk about growth and more revenues and geographical expansion. But value is also about customers. It's satisfaction. It is retention. Well, a few things that you touched on, and that's exactly the sort of challenge that I see more and more in the MT world, if I can put it like this, where not only you have to define what you mean with value, but also you have to measure it. And obviously, doing markets by markets, you use two important international markets are great examples. So thanks for showing and sharing this perspective. Great. All right. Next, I would like to invite Yulia Akulkova from Nimzy Insights to share her perspective. Welcome, Yulia.
Thank you very much. Sharing a screen in a second, and you should be able to see it. Please say it or nod. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Janice. So I would like to thank you for having me today here. It was totally unexpected for me as well. As we know, it was supposed to be Joseph Kubowski, who is the CEO of Nimzy Insights. Nimzy is the research and consultancy company. We do research and consultancy specifically tailored towards the localization and translation industry and everything that comes in between and beyond, maybe even. But of course, there is some data and analysis that we conduct around machine translation. And before I share some of the very, basic data points, two words about myself. Why am I actually allowed to do this talk on behalf of Joseph? As Janice kindly introduced this term, early adopters of MT earlier today in her presentation. Well, I can consider myself an early adopter as well, because I work in a professional localization since 2010, and in MT in particular, since I think 2012. And already in 2014, I was participating as a panelist, of course, in my first MT-related discussion in Dublin. It was Lock Leaders Forum, and we had Olga Bergovaya monitoring it all. Probably you will know her. Anyway, that's me and my MT journey. So I could relate to, or can relate to, the stages of the MT adoption already outlined by Janice. And now to the data points. Okay, so is MT bringing joy to the world? As this is the Christmas season, almost season approaching. This is the title. Well, here I'm just sharing the data points from 3 distinct studies conducted by Nimzy Insights. And before, well, you can see that on the screen. I will, of course, read it out loud for those that are just listening to us and can't look at the screen. But before the disclaimer, because any person who listens to it or sees it might wonder where this data is coming from. What are these 72% or 54%? Who are these people answering those surveys? I do question this always whenever I see any results. So the disclaimer is that this is based on data obtained during 3 distinct studies conducted by Nimzy in 2021. So this is recent data. And these studies are the Nimzy 100. It was a survey of 250 LSPs conducted this year, and then 2 additional surveys were aimed at the buyers of language services, including, of course, MT, with both like upward of 100 of respondents, and also conducted this year. And here are the results obtained from these 3 studies. So as for the Lsp market, and as far as it is concerned, language service provider market, MT is the 2nd most widely offered service in our industry already. What is it? It encompasses everything: MT, raw MT, MTP, of course, or PMT, how some call it, and other MT-related services, such as data sanitation, data labeling, all-around data. LSPs have already started offering it a couple of years ago. And then MT adoption is, of course, growing. Also, this statement is supported, I think, by the data provided by Janice as well. And according to the data by Nimzy, 84% of buyers of language services already say they are using MT in one way or another. And then Nimzy estimates the global market for MT-related services quite large numbers, I would say. And this is not my estimate, but I'm still here to read it out loud. Between 2.6 and $3 billion. Okay, you can say this is good statistics, but actually Bruno and Felipe asked the panelists to be provocative and to also point on some provocative questions. So this is good, but is like MT really what the buyers want? And by buyers here, we mean actually anyone who buys MT in one way or another, be it a stock MT or trainable MT, adaptive MT, or MTP services. And here is again some information. Actually, if Vaso from Commit Global is watching us now, because I think I saw her in the list of participants. So this is from our mutual study with Nimzy and Commit Global, also this year's. And this is like the response about how buyers of like language services are rating the raw MT output. As you can see, the the good percentage is that like overall it is satisfying, and it also could be used with minimum human editing, meaning machine translation, post editing, for example. And these numbers are much higher, of course, than were actually even in the early years of NMT, because even back then, what feedback we used to obtain, the majority of the respondents would opt for this option. Probably you among them as well, or at least some of you. Then this gives us some things to think about, but the conclusion we made in this study, from which I just shared some statistics, is that what actually buyers want is maybe not always to have those evaluations and trainings and all the, like human in the loop services supported by themselves. So probably easier plug and play solutions that would pay attention to all MT related stuff themselves, such as like context, and perform evaluations on MT and measurements automatically, and then finally present the user with the most suitable MT option. So those solutions would be like the most desirable way forward for enterprises. I can relate, love to have such a solution, but do we have it already? Does the market have to already has to offer that? Indeed, but of course, partially. For example, options like that with all the MT auto select are already available in several TMS providers, including MemSource. I saw someone on MemSource joining us today. Thank you. But in general, MT market is fragmented. And the statistics and data shows us that publicly available engines are still the go-to solutions for most customers. 46% of companies do use these, like publicly available, like stock engines and stuff. Not everybody is using, this kind of magical MT auto select solutions just yet. And why? Well, because they are not exactly available in many options. Still, if you would want to monitor this MT market, of course, you should probably follow a couple of brands and names and technology developments and developers who are working in these areas. We have, for example, Konstantin from Intento here today, right? And he will probably speak very soon. But when we started, for example, when I started my MT journey, there were no such companies, unfortunately. Back then, all the evaluations, both automatic and human evaluations, had to be done on premises by the company who is trying to join or hop on the merry board of MT train. But now Intento or Custom MT here, these are companies that actually help a lot with the analyzing of what is going on with MT engines per se and the market in general. And also, I won't read out loud all other names listed here, but I would say that Nimzy rates these technology providers on the list here as the important brands to track if you are on the MT journey, and I think that you are. How now do we assess the MT market and MT engines performance? And here we get almost to the end of my speech, because that's maybe where we should, of course, talk with Konstantin, and I think he will speak about that later. But we were also asked to say, okay, there is this wonderful Intento report, which has a lot of data about exactly assessing the MT market, but how do we use it? How a linguist or an enterprise or an Lsp would benefit actually from this data gathered and provided to us freely by Intento. And this is just an example of how we use it, how I personally use Intento report. So first and foremost, of course, to keep up with the new developments in MT market, as we just said, then what I always do is check which language combinations and domains are better suited by which engines, because Intento provides those charts of where you can map and the engines with their performance and actually see which engines are better for your case. Then from there, you can start your own evaluation, but still you have narrowed down the list, because as you saw before, the market is quite large. So then the data sets and how they perform, how they are developed and created and sanitized, this is also explained by Intento, not necessarily only in a report, but gives an example, an idea. And what is different in this year's report as compared to the last year's report, as far as I remember, is that Intento this time gave us the great evaluation, great information on what metrics and scores used, what new metrics appeared, why they are better, etc., etc. Because previously it was mostly actually poor, but now much more intriguing, exciting metrics. And then also new information about open source MT engines. And then also, this is not necessarily coming from the report, but I also played around some Intento tools and just to see how different customized MT can be, for example, based on my own data sets from the stock MT. So that's that. This is, I think this is good enough. And again, for free. Back in the day, we didn't have this luxury of such data put out for us. But in any case, of course, it's in the end your choice, and you are the one to experiment with all of that. Rushing through MT-related trends, we can discuss them in the Q&A session, or we cannot. But this is basically everything I wanted to touch on. Yep, this is the quote from another colleague about the future, about where we are headed with MT, and like multilingual meetings. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. And I'm really glad you mentioned these insights and this data, because one of the challenges for buyers, who might be more or less aware of what MT does and does not, is to find the way through the number of options that are available. So you mentioned at the end there are some new trends, but even if we consider what we have today, it might be quite difficult for a number of buyers to make a decision just because there is too much, not to understand, but also to decide on, because sometimes it's, it is so close that you might say, okay, why should I choose for option A versus option B, because they are so close. And those decisions are not taken lightly by anyone. And of course, the more data, the more insights you get, the better you can be advised in this process of decision making. So yep, I'm really glad you mentioned all that. And you mentioned several times Konstantin and Intento. So the best I can do now is to invite Konstantin to take the screen. Konstantin, up to you.
So yeah, my name is Konstantin. I'm CEO and co-founder of Intento, where we help to build best-of-breed MT solutions and use them across the enterprise. And I will try, actually, I will not use slides here, because usually I talk with lots of charts. This is not the case, and I will not dare to cover the report, which Yulia mentioned is a bit too extensive, I think, for the time we have. So I just want to talk in general about this data-driven approach and why we all need it, and what other tools we can use there. So when we speak about the role of machine translation for business, I think that first and foremost, we consider it as a tool to do more. And despite quite large localization budgets, which build this 40 billion language services market, we often see that companies still cannot go after all markets they want. And most importantly, they cannot be fully accessible and inclusive to their peers worldwide and among their own employees. And the first step here, I think, to understand how much more you need to do. And we see that companies who do ballpark estimates, they see that they need to translate about 20 times more than they do translate today with human services. And where do those 20 times come from? Well, some of it is what we may call known nouns, is basically just translating all existing content to languages and of all markets company works on. And then there are some known unknowns, which are typically real-time translation cases, because you know that, for example, in customer service, you would like to translate live chats and calls, but you know that it's impossible with human translation, so you just don't do that. And finally, we see that there are unknown amounts as well. And that I think Jen has shown very well that despite of this large variety of cases, there are still new coming in, which were not envisioned before. And we see a lot of it as different real-time translation cases, for example, for legal departments and for financial procurement departments, which emerge when there's some knowledge spread inside the company that there's a good machine translation that delivers, and new departments come to use it. And across our customers, at some companies, we see as many as 20, 25 different use cases for machine translation. And a lot of them is about also all sorts of internal communication, because I think that's a bit new in understanding the value of localization. Is that it's not only just monetary value, that you can earn more money while spending less money. Of course, it's important, but still we see that more and more localization is perceived as a way to be more accessible by people speaking different languages. And that's where lots of value comes from. And that gives start to lots of new use cases. When you understand that you want to translate internal communication to all languages your employees speak, even that your official language may be English. But it's still important to make everyone feel comfortable. And we see that machine translation is precisely this tool, which helps to do 20 times more in such cases. Because without that, well, if you just go to language service provider, well, typical, some more advanced, but typically you get an answer that it's quite easy to do 20 times more. You just need to pay 20 times more. But that's not always work. And but also we see that when you start this machine translation journey from this couple of most important use cases, couple of languages, it's easy to find yourself in a dead end. What I mean by that is that solution you've selected may work for one use case and type of content, but may be inapplicable to another. And in the simplest case, it may be just about the language support and the quality for different languages and types of content. Because for some languages and domains, you might pick almost any MT engine and get decent quality. And for others, you would need to make a prudent choice. And for some, none of the stock engines provide decent quality, so you need to go and customize machine translation. And then for some languages, you have enough content to do deep customization. And for others, you have a little bit of content, so you need to look for a machine translation engine, which customizes well on this fewer amount of data. And then some use cases have specific requirements. For example, and that's probably like in the enterprise setting, is that the most prominent example is that when it's about colloquial content such as live chats, you not only don't have data to train it, because typically you don't translate this type of content with humans, but also you need to take care of a right and consistent tone of voice, formal versus informal. And very few MT engines support that. And those maybe are not the same MT engines you selected for your regular localization content. This type of choice, what to use for what use case, is very similar to how you choose human translators for different types of content, because you probably don't want the same translator to translate your marketing, legal, and corporate culture content. In case of human translation, LSPs typically take care of that. They sort of remove this pain of managing those resources. In case of machine translation, this may not work. And of course, part of it is sort of this inevitable conflict between earning more human services and enabling to do more and cheaper using machine translation. However, the biggest reason I think is that typically language service providers have limited visibility into the enterprise scenarios, with all kinds of real-time translation being sort of outside of their scope. And we see that the most successful cases is when a company forms its internal MT program and has people to run it, well, as Janice described, they do. And that's where they need to be able to judge what's based on the language, content type, available data, and so on. And procurement department typically cannot help here, as they got used to procuring software systems by choosing the best vendor by features and price. And here you have a situation when it's just no single best vendor. And you have to pick the right one. You need to collect some data, crunch some numbers, compare 20 to 30 systems. So that's where you need to be data-driven internally. And part of it is just you need to know what vendor works best on what language pair and what domain and so on. So to avoid everyone making the same exercise over and over by themselves, we actually publish this report so that we do it annually. We work with TAOs for data to get high quality data in different domains, different language pairs. We run all those 40, well, I think, okay, 29 in the last report, machine translation systems on this data, and we provide some insights. And I think one of these interesting insights from the last report was that it's not only quality improves and changes, and you need to combine about 9 different systems to get the best quality, but also language support is widening. And last year it went from 16,000 language pairs to more than 100,000 language pairs. It's really more than 300 languages, which is super important for this inclusivity task. But then in some cases, you can just use such a report as is when you use stock engines. As again, as Jenny described, there's a number of cases when you're fine with stock engines. Sometimes you need something on top of them, and that's we take care of that at Intento. We're providing ability to use glossary with any stock engine and to use tone of voice control, gender control, some other things. But then for post-editing cases, you typically need customization. And in this case, there is no silver bullet. You cannot decide which custom engine works for you the best without actually training this engine and testing it on your data. There is no way of automatic oracle which will help you. So we run such evaluations for many customers. I think we're about to publish annual sort of statistics. We evaluated about 900 engines this year, but also for some of the companies of the market, we publish tools to do that. So we made about a year ago, we published first version of MT Studio, and it helps to crunch those numbers without inviting us, which we're happy about. But then it's not ends there, because once you set up the system, you need to collect feedback about how it works. Part of it is to improve the system based on this feedback. And we see that there are no way you can get to high, for example, user satisfaction without actually getting feedback from the users and improving based on this feedback. And when you do that, we see a really astonishing 97% of user satisfaction, which we presented with some of the customers at Clockwork some time ago. And then another thing when you need feedback is to actually get this monetary value, because the reality of the market is that if you come to your human services provider and say that, okay, that's my best machine translation engine, certified, they probably will tell you, so what? Because there's no data to drive any sort of negotiation around prices and discounts and rates. And the only way you can get this data is to actually analyze what's happening with your post-editing and what actions post-editors do, and how it compares to translation memory leverage, both, well, in terms of the effort, in terms of the number of edits. Because then you can set your threshold properly, and you can go to your language service provider and argue that, okay, if they do much more edits for translation memories of certain fuzzy matches, then perhaps you shouldn't be paying for editing machine translation much more than that. It's strange. So those, just to summarize, we see that lots of data needed to make this choice and build the system. But that's not where it ends. You need lots of data in your production phase. You need to be able to collect lots of data. And that's where I think we'll see lots of changes in nearest future. Because as of today, as many companies say, it's a bit hard to collect data from production, even for conventional post-editing use case, because this data is just not available for TMS systems. You don't have it there for many reasons, again, because the market is built this way mostly. And we'll see it will changing. We also put some effort to change it, which I hope we'll present sometime soon. Yeah, but this is the only way to get value in future. Yes, is to collect data today and think about how to build a system to collect this data. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. And indeed, I like what you said, or what you insisted on at the end. It's that data should be, used at all stages, at all times, because it's really important, really, to not just use data in the beginning. And I think Janice also insisted on that data is your best companion if you are a buyer of MT and other technologies, by the way, because first of all, to make a decision, and then to optimize and to make the maintenance, or I would say the evolution of the technology more sustainable. So there are quite a number of challenges there, and data is certainly a great way for buyers themselves, but also for people who need to be convinced by buyers to sort of open their eyes on what needs to be done. So that's great. I would like to remind everybody that questions are more than welcome online. We'll open the floor after Michelle for questions live. So if you want to wait and ask your questions with your webcam or without your webcam live, you can do that. But of course, feel free to put your questions online and make sure that we can share those questions with the panelists. But now I would like to invite Michel Lopez from E2F to join the discussion and to share his perspective. Thanks, Michel, for joining us. I cannot hear you. I'm not sure if it's me or...
Yeah, I was muted, so that's a good reason. So again, I'm Michel Lopez. I'm the CEO of E2F. So E2F, we have two activities. We are traditional LSP, but in the last few years, we have become our largest activity now has become to do data annotation. What meaning is that we are helping large tech companies building their AI engines. So we're doing that in speech, in text for natural NLP, natural language processing, in MT, and as well as in search. So we have, to do that, we have built our own platform. So we have a pretty complex workflow-based platform for data annotation, where we use AI at different steps of the process and everything to try to provide the best quality data for training of our customers' engines. But then on the other side, on the localization side, we are kind of agnostic. So we have decided, at least for the time being, not to build our own technology. So we are partnering with translation platforms, with different translation tools, and using them to process. So we typically use the tools or the platform used by our clients, and then we just translate. And in these situations, so we see MT as a productivity enhancement tool. But to build on what Konstantin was just saying, frankly, LSPs, and I don't know whether I talk only for myself here, but the fact that the tools are really not adapted to MT is really frustrating. So if you look at all the translation platforms and the translation tools out there, they've been built around the old TMS model. And basically, the only way that they are using MT, more or less, most of the tools these days, is basically replacing the translation step, the human translation step, by MT. But to my knowledge, no tool has really done everything that they could to really put technology at the center and enable companies such as ours to build completely different workflows. So what they don't do is they don't use scoring within the process. They don't use empty comparisons on a string by string basis. You have to pretty much empty the whole file before you go in post edit, where you would like to do that in a more interactive way. They don't do things such as comparing, for example, the number of edits that have been done. I mean, calculating the number of edits that have been done by a particular translator, and in using this measure to decide whether you should have another translator looking at it or not. You know, all those kind of things that we can imagine would build workflows that are really putting AI at the center, and I don't see that happening. So that's what, you know, what we don't know here is kind of my message to all the tools people out there. Are they going to be able to get away from their current model and then change the structure, keep all the connectors that they have, keep all the clients that they have, but really change the translation environments, or whether we're going to have a new player out there who's going to build a new system, which is going to be like much more powerful than we have now, calculating things within the process, calculating the number of edits, as I said, calculating the score by comparing to the English, calculating the efforts of in terms of number of edits, of time spent, that would inform companies like us so that we can provide fair pricing to our clients. So all those things, everything that Intento is doing, for example, he has all the components of what could be a perfect, very production-ready translation environments, but nobody yet has integrated all those features in a seamless way during the translation process. So it's always, you machine translate, then you send to your post editor. Once the post editors are done, then you can do scoring, or you can do effort calculation, but it's not integrated, right? It's not what I would like to see is all those scores, all these AI being used during the process and to inform the workflow. Things like, as I said, what you would, I could really imagine a system where you send to post editing only those strings that AI decided through scoring system that they should be post edited. And then once it's been post edited, maybe you could send to a reviewer only the ones that a machine again calculates that the risk is pretty high. There's been many changes. You don't understand why. Well, then you send to a second person, right? Now we have no way to do that. So now when we send a file to a post editor, well, we have to send the whole file pretty much. There's no way with the current tools to isolate those strings, those sentences that should be reworked. So that's pretty much what I had to say here. I think that the industry is pretty relatively mature, with companies like Intento as far as scoring, as far as calculation and all that. But the tools, the translation tools industry is still very embryonic as far as using those tools in the right way.
All right, thank you, Michel, for your perspective. I see that there is a question online for Janice, which is, what is the UQF score exactly? So you mentioned in your presentation or in your speech the UQF score, and Kirill from Intento is asking what it is exactly.
I don't remember that. UQF, you must have been reading something really tiny then. Maybe I should look at the slide. I think there was it on the slide where you saw the dashboards?
Kirill, if you are online, feel free to, yeah, he just said yes.
Okay. Well, that was a score that somebody invented, a unified, like a quality index. And I was actually opposed to it, but somebody overrode me because what they did was they weighted like a blue score with a TER and edit distance and came up with a total score. And I don't think that you can do that. I don't think that I'm not a mathematician, but I don't think that it's logical. So, but we don't really use it. Somebody created it and felt it was a good idea to have indexes. Indices can be good, but that one to me, trying to compare apples to oranges and then create an index out of it, I didn't agree with it. So just ignore those little tiny things. It's like an old dashboard, by the way. So sorry, it's just a bit old.
All right. Thanks, Janice. Any question for panelists now? Constantine, you want to add something? Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question to Janice. So
Yeah.
you mentioned that you use some sort of feedback to inform changes in machine translation. But I'm curious, did you find a way or do you use feedback and performance monitoring to write content differently to make it more to make machine translation more applicable to content? So is it only goes into optimizing machine translation, or it also goes into optimizing the source part?
It's only used to optimize the machine translation training or choice of engine. But you make a really good point, and I'm going to remind you that I think we localized did a presentation about that at one of the MT conferences recently. Maybe I don't know if it was Gala Connect or maybe it was even at the last MT Summit, but Alex Janaszewski, and I'm sorry to quote him, but he did a really good presentation about how some of the metrics then they're able to go back to the authors and get them to rewrite the content or to look at how it might better suit translatability, MT translatability. We have tried to give feedback to authors. Of course, we have like about 120 some products, and they all don't belong, all the authors aren't in all the same group. Many of them are moving into the same group, but it's really difficult to give them feedback. They think it's great. Some of like the DX, the digital experience content, allows people to give feedback, users to give feedback, and those will go to the authors. But as far as from MT, no, we haven't been very successful. And the only thing that we can do is maybe ask them to add some fixes in the authoring tools that they use, which sometimes helps. Oh, by the way, I just want to say, I love your reports. I've told you many times, and I even gave you some feedback, but I just love those reports, and I just want to give you kudos for that.
Thanks.
Constantine, I'm not sure if you have more questions for Janice or.
No, the reason I'm asking is because I see that on one hand, we see some of our customers, they find lots of optimization through working with source rather than working with machine translation or working with vendors, translation vendors. And on another hand, we also see lots of situations when you just cannot solve it using machine translation because the source is not internationalizable enough, basically, so that every translator has to do about the same changes to the source content when they're translating, effectively doing transcreation. And the only way to solve it is to just take their post edits, but not send them for training, but translate them back to English and go to copywriters and ask them if they can really write this way. Because if English to German translator changes it this way and English to Japanese translator changes it this way, exactly the same way, then probably there's something wrong at the source.
So I raise my hand if I can ask a question to Konstantin. So talking about the source or maybe just methodology, you and I had discussed at one time software strings, which are extremely difficult to use MT with because there's so little context. And you were considering at one time of having some sort of a context available to the MT engine, so that you would translate the whole sort of a more context and then pull out the string. So I don't know where that's evolved since then, and I wondered if you had any ideas about how to approach using to MT software. It's not like help in marketing, where at least you have a lot of context there, and usually we do a lot of post editing on those. So any ideas?
It evolved in one particular direction, that about maybe 1 month ago, we launched a special sort of, so we have, besides of just sending data to different engines, we have our own MT augmentation layer, which you may think about as automatic post editing, basically. Depending on the use case, we may either fix gender or fix tone of voice or something else. So for software strings, we recently released a feature for ICU translation, because a couple of our customers told us that the problem is even human translators cannot translate ICU. Because ICU, if you know about this format, is this parameterized software string about plurals and gender, and it's built like a small program. The problem is translators are not really exactly engineers, and they have hard time reading those ICU strings. And even human translation of them is very bad, because they cannot understand that. So we built a system which basically expands ICU template, considering different possible values of its parameters, so that it's translated considering all possible contexts. Let me say this way. It's able to find issues when you have a limited number of plurals in your source text, and then you translate to Arabic when you have much more. So that's what we've built, and we got already feedback that it outperforms human translation by far, not because of superior linguistic quality, just because of human translators do much more errors when they work with those very specific software strings. That's where we're moving in this direction.
Great. Any question for panelists? Without webcam, with webcam, feel free to jump in now.
I have a question for Nimzy, if that's okay. I know it's supposed to be people in the audience, but I don't see any. So if nobody has one, I'll ask one.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so we often get asked, there are certain linguistic groups, and I won't name them, that really are perfectionist, and they want more than a human translation. Sometimes they like to have things, rewritten, or what's the created in some way, which is not very cost effective when you have huge amounts of help and support content, for example. But we did find in some experiments, and I don't know that they were purely scientific, that in the absence of content in their language, they preferred to have even bad MT, because they couldn't necessarily find information, perform it. It wasn't like they just left, they already own the products, or they probably will continue to subscribe to them. Obviously, retention is dependent on having content in people's language, but they seem to prefer, even internal teams preferred, when they were very fussy about the human translations, they were less fussy about MT when it came to, that's all I have. We don't support that in their language. Do you have any reports that you've done on that? You did mention a few things where percentages of people who prefer MT or don't. You talked about that in the beginning. Do you have anything more, any other comments to make about that? Whether you find the same thing, that people will prefer it in the absence of something in their language?
Yeah, Yulia.
Oh, that was for Yulia. Sorry, I don't hear her.
Well, not exactly in that context. So because today's panel is based on data, I wouldn't want to provide any data that I don't have at hand. But what Nimzy has at hand, and has conducted a survey on, again, and a study, a specialized study with like almost 7,000 of respondents across the globe was confirming this assumption that the content in the native language is perceived much better. It was also, of course, the report we published. I would probably need to be precise in order to be precise, to revisit what it said about how exactly this content was translated. Like, was it done via MTP, or was it just any content in the original language, that the user's original language, I mean. But the general trend is confirming this assumption. That's true. That the information I can confirm as well from the research perspective.
You know what I may add here? I also confirmed that we had a couple of cases where linguists thought that machine translation quality is not good enough to be used as a row, say on front page of some quite well-known company, and they sort of because, for example, 20% of sentences need to be corrected by linguists. But then it was some internal decision to make a pilot with actual live users to give them this translation option and see if they decided to revert to English. And in absolute, I cannot give you exact number, but many users which have their browser locale set to their language, they're not supported by the web page, they preferred to use this translation. And this is the way to overcome certain internal blockers in the enterprise, where, because, you know, sometimes you have too few linguists, but sometimes you have too many. Sometimes you just don't want linguists between translation and the user.
I would agree with you, and we did some studies of that, and I showed you some where, you know, how often did they click back to the English source? Not that often.
Exactly.
I mean, when they did, I think in the beginning we saw more of it, and I think that was more of the phenomenon of, you know, it's so new and it's fun and let's just try it and click back and forth, but that calmed down after a while. Another thing that we did do at really early on, when we used, of course, Adobe Analytics to do some of these experiments. And then we looked at how many of our visitors to our different marketing content pages actually used online tools, like online MT tools, like Google or Bing or Baidu, Yandex. And we were able to actually, at that time, I don't know that we can still do that, but we just said how many people are actually going outside, you know, clicking on the URL and getting that content translated. That gave us an indication that, well, let's keep them in our ecosystem by offering MT, you know, hopefully a little bit better MT than just a generic online service. But obviously people will want to read the content, and MT, if that's the only choice, that's what they'll pick.
If I'm allowed to intervene, I was thinking about your comments on people wanting to use MT rather than the translation. The first, when you mentioned it, Janice, and then when Konstantin mentioned about the front page option of people not clicking back to the language. In some way, isn't all about expectation in the first place? People know that someone has translated that, so it's human. So their expectations towards the content are higher. So they tend to be more criticists about the content. And on the other hand, regarding switching back to English or not, I mean, I think that most people, if they understand English well enough, they don't use MT at all. So those that do use MT, they stay there because they don't understand English enough, so they won't revert back. I'm not saying this is the case, but I think it's a very fair assumption to do. I don't know the answer. Of course, it's something very gray. But I think that is also, in the case of reverting to English, at least, I think I'm almost sure that that it's because of not knowing any better. In the case of the human translation being considered more fuzzy, it has to do with the expectation. I know this because when we provide MT to clients, of course, they're not so happy, but also the price is lower. So then again, it's also expectation, right? When people pay a little bit more, or they see that the human has been involved and it took longer, they're going to expect something better. So not wanting to giving some fuzzy data on metrics, I think this is something that we need to think about as well, I think.
I totally agree with you, and I think you're right in making those assumptions. I can tell you that analytics are really great for telling you what people do, what's the behavior, but it never tells you why. So the only way that you can find out why is actually polling people, doing sampling, you know, maybe some kind of more targeted type of user testing, but we don't know why. We don't know why they do it. We just know what they do. So we have to make assumptions, but we could be very wrong about them.
I totally agree, and that's actually
Sorry
the
for not
reason
turning my
why
camera, but
when
it's a bit dark already, and I don't have lights on, so I wanted to intervene. But yeah, sorry, Konstantin, please continue.
that's the reason why in all MT evaluations we run them as blind study, and we always include human translation without telling it's human translation, because we want to remove this bias. And we see that when post editors get human translation thinking it's machine translation, then you actually see how they approach post editing. Do they approach it in a way that if you may not edit it, just don't edit it, or they tend to edit it more rigorously than even when they review human translation? It's very, very clearly visible. And we have a number of cases where in this blind review, machine translation actually was better accepted than human translation. But in those cases, mostly, we of course, with our customers, we dived into details because we needed to understand what's going on. It turned out that it's in case of large projects where lots of human translators involved. If you pick text translated by different human translators, then they are a bit inconsistent, and machine is much more consistent in this case and a bit more acceptable. So absolutely, there's this placebo effect.
Right?
Yeah.
Customized machine translation, maybe, because
yeah, of course,
the
of course,
one, I don't think it's consistent. That's one of the things
highly
that I get surprised. Okay, that's one of the things I get surprised with NMT.
Yes.
At least when I have clients that don't have enough data to gather and to MT, we use generic, and it's so inconsistent. Even in the technical language, it can use a lot of different wording for, let's say, legal into English, and that's very surprising. It's one of the things I think that is more, it's more of a problem with MT, and MT is consistency in terms of terminology. At least this is our personal experience at Upwards, but I don't know if you feel that as well. I mean, I would just like to pick your brains on that.
Sometimes MT gets
bad. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say it gets a bad rap. I have a little bit of a story kind of related to what Konstantin said. Sometimes it gets a bad rap unfairly, sometimes quite fairly, you know, but because it's known to do some crazy things from time to time, even when you train the engines. But one time we got a complaint from one of our vendors about the terrible, really terrible quality of translation for a particular very well-known product at Adobe. The linguists were complaining about the fact that the Ukrainian and the Hungarian were just really awful machine translation. And I had to tell them very bluntly that, well, we do not connect We don't have any engines for Hungarian and Ukrainian that are trained, and we don't use it for that content. They're not connected. So unfortunately, I think it's your own translations that are kind of bad because we don't use MT for those two for that product.
Yeah, it's actually when you're mentioning that brings something to light. I mean, that I get. Whenever we perform a translation that the client doesn't like, and we work a lot with marketing departments as well, the first thing they tell us is that it MT, not it's badly translated, but that MT has been used. And that's like, how do you know? I mean, it's not the case because when we work with marketing departments, we don't use MT, but it's the first thing they tell us is that this is MT. I mean, and that's true. I mean, there's a certain prejudice about MT, especially because now everything that people perceive as being bad, they just say it's MT, and it's even bad for us as companies that when we don't provide MT, they just, instead of being more detail oriented and saying you need to change this and this and this, they just say it's MT and revise it. That's what they say.
I think it's TMs. I think that's to blame a lot of times. It gets very stilted after a while. It gets used over and over again in different contexts. So I think that obviously I don't want to go down that path, but probably cleanup needs to be done from time to time, or sometimes maybe linguists just don't continue to edit it because it's 100% match or something like that. So I don't know what the causes are, but often when we're not using MT, we do get complaints that says this sounds like MT, and it's not.
I just wanted to say exactly the same, that actually TM is this blind spot, because we assume that if it's in context match, we may just not review it. But what in fact, when we train MT engines, we have about 40 data cleaning steps. And at some point we added 2 more. One of them is checking internal consistency of the translation memory. And second, checking how much translation memory complies to the glossary. And that boosted MT performance a lot, because it turned out that really TM is just like this, dusty corner where you collect things over many, many, many years. And if they do not pop up from there for a certain reason, then you just don't care if they are in this, it's like infinite closet. But then when you do training, you suddenly get all that in your custom MT engine. And that's a reason to look more closer at TM and clean it up. So consistency is very important, and I'm not sure how actually it's solved in maybe Michelle can tell if they do something with TMs for their customers to make them more happy.
Usually customers don't want us to clean the TMs, right? Because usually they consider that to be their main asset, and they do not understand the level of dustiness and dust and that you were mentioning. Once in a while, we are asked to do this kind of measure cleaning, but usually most of our customers are not. I don't know why, but they trust the TM more than they trust us in a way, which is usually wrong. But so. But I agree with you, when we do those exercise of consistency checking and glossary checking, we find a lot of issues. But don't you think when you train engines, Konstantin, why don't you only take like the most recent version of the TM only strings that have been actually used in the last iteration of the product or something like that, which is automatically remove all those old sentences, the segments that are not properly translated?
Well, the reality is that we use whatever we have, and some companies, they have just everything in one place mixed together in one TM, because it's much better when it's split, but sometimes there's no way to do that.
So you cannot use only recent strings.
Yeah, sometimes we get it in without this metadata. Yeah.
There's actually a question in the chat from Jeragana. I hope my pronunciation is correct. And Jeragana is saying, as a company, we work exclusively with Asian languages. And in the report of Intento, there is very limited data for only particular language pairs. So is there any insight from any of the panelists on what the evolution in this area will be in the next few years? Maybe Yulia, you might have some data about that.
Not exactly, sorry to disappoint, because we have noticed like the same trend, maybe, that there is just, you know, like enough data with regards to one particular brands of MT engines and language pairs correspondingly, and just, you know, like not so many data points with regards to the others. And there are, of course, some reasons to that. For example, the most the most easier one would be the barriers and language barriers also. And so I don't know what Konstantin will comment on that, but for example, when we at Nimzy evaluate some of, not exactly like the MT engine's performance, but let's say MT provider as a company, right? So when we reach out to Asian providers, it's not that easy and smoothly all the communication and obtaining actually any data points about their performance as it is with all the European Union and Russian and of course the United States ones. So that would be it. And also another point is that there are some brands that are prominent, and I mean MT engines, for example, Udao, Tencent, and MT engines that are already used and provide good enough results, but I wouldn't dare to make any assumptions about the evolution of it, because the question was about evolution. So I might as well just shut up and pass the mic to Konstantin. For example, Konstantin, to phrase this, like,
yeah.
why don't you include more Asian providers into your evaluations? Well, I have assumptions about it, but maybe you could unveil them.
Oh, about the report, it's actually very simple. It's based on the available data. So I wish we had high quality data in like Vietnamese and in more domains than we have, but we don't have it. And we can use very special types of data for this report. It shouldn't be too public, and it cannot be proprietary data. Of course, when we work with specific customers, Asian languages is one of the most popular, because that's where you want to really increase MT quality. That's where you don't get it enough. It's Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. And what's visible there first is for each of those languages, as you said, Yulia, there's typically a set of local providers which do better baseline models than your usual suspects. Like for Chinese, it's Tencent, for simplified, and Baidu for traditional. For Korean, it's Never, and so on. And for Japanese, there is Rosetta, there is Mirai, and a number of other local vendors. Another thing is, but they local providers typically are not as technically sophisticated as major ones, meaning that you cannot really train them to the same extent as you can train Google or modern MT or Microsoft or Amazon. And then you have to look what works better for you. And in some case, you go for Japanese or for Korean to Google because you can train it more on your data which you have. And in other cases, when you see that training doesn't bring value, for example, colloquial content, you may go to Naver, because Naver supports tone of voice natively, this Korean honorifics, and you would prefer having them write in your live chat rather than having terminology from training, because you cannot really train Naver. So I would say, like, to summarize, it's more sophisticated with Asian languages, of course. the local providers you need to evaluate. There's another issue which may be a bit between, how to say, it's in between different parts of the localization tool chain. It's that when you do good translation, for example, from English to Japanese, very often your sentence structure changes a lot. So as your tags in your sentences should change a lot. And sometimes TMS system is just built in a way that it doesn't allow for such substantial changes in text. It's maybe a bit deep topic for this discussion, but we've seen lots of bottlenecks, not in MT itself, but in how the whole localization pipeline is built for Asian languages. Like in video translation, sometimes you need to actually exclude TMS to make sure that you can translate Japanese the way you want it to be translated. So when you just run through a normal localization pipeline, you have to do lots of edits afterwards.
And in Japanese, particularly, Konstantin, there's also a very big complexity for us is that the human evaluation of Japanese is a lot more subjective than it's in other languages. So, I mean, any translation company knows that when you translate into Japanese, you use your best linguist and it comes back from the client saying that was crap. So you use another linguist or you establish a link with the reviewer on the Japanese side and suddenly it becomes better and you don't know why. So the same translation will be evaluated like completely differently by human translators. So that's a very complex thing. And we also involved, as I said, in the training of machine translation into different languages. And Japanese is also the same thing. When we send data sets for training to our client, it always comes back with this is good or this is bad, and we don't really know why. It seems that this is a lot less objective than it is in Western European languages, for example.
Michel, on another notice, we're lucky to have several Japanese customers, and in the beginning, we were working with them using their traditional approach with synchronous translation, right? But then over time, we switched to machine translation, and everyone is happy and everything moving much faster than before. Although, of course, it's not perfect, and there's lots of subjectivity in how good is that. But once you have it in your workflow, that you can get substantially good translation English to Japanese, both directions, things moving so fast and smooth, and you close deals so much faster that there's no doubt.
Human out of the loop.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt because we are running out of time. I know there was one more comment and one more question in the chat, but unfortunately, we are really running out of time. So we could probably continue this conversation for quite some time, and we'll have more value cast on this topic. So for panelists and for the audience who couldn't ask some questions today, just stay tuned. We will organize more value cast on this topic so that more questions and more comments can be made. So I would like to thank, first of all, the audience for joining us today, for staying until the end of this 90 minutes discussion. I would like to thank a lot all panelists for accepting the invitation, for sharing slides, for sharing data and insights. And of course, I would like to thank Philip for setting everything up. And now it's time for us to say goodbye. And we do hope to see you again in the next ValueCast. Thanks a lot.